Everyone, I think we'll get going here. My name's Lee Hartmann. I'm the Director of Planning and Development. Apologize, got a little bit of a cold. Hopefully I'll be better in a couple days. We're very lucky today also to have Judi Barrett from Barrett Planning Group here, as she's the consultant who is working with us through the MBTA communities. So what we want to do tonight is just give you a presentation, little 101 about the MBTA community law. We've identified preliminarily 7 sites. We wanted to make sure that we could meet the requirements of the state. So the first cut here is to show you some examples of sites that we think could work. And really the goal here is we want to hear from you about what you've seen, what you think, how you think the town should proceed. Because we do have to bring this to town meeting for a vote. And we need, well, it would be a majority vote. We need a vote of town meeting to approve it. So a lot of decision-making to be made. And again, the first thing here is to hear from the community so we can go back to the planning board, select board, and tell them what we've heard from the community. So with that, I'll turn it over to Judi.
Thank you. So hi, everyone. It's always great to be back in Plymouth. So my goal is just to really give you kind of an overview of this law and maybe dispel some misinformation that might be out there, but also just make sure you have the facts about where things stand, so you can make good choices. I think one of the great things about working in Plymouth always is that the town tends to be ahead of the game. So I can just assure you, because the planning department's been pretty proactive about this, your town in many ways is in a better position to make some decisions than a lot of other towns that we're working with. So I have a small planning firm in Hingham. I've worked for the town of Plymouth before. I have 10 planners in my staff, and I would say at any given moment, about half of our workload right now is related to this law. And so it's been rather difficult for some communities, and others seem to be able to kind of deal with it without a whole lot of trouble. So anyway, I want to give you an overview of the law. I want to go through what we're calling the compliance guidelines. So the way this works, there's a statute, it's very broad. A state agency was asked to create guidelines to implement the law. So we have to pay attention to both what the broad statute says as well as the guidelines that are set by the state. There is also a model, it's a computer model, that communities have to use to show that the areas that they are proposing to rezone will actually meet all the requirements of the law. So there's both guidelines for how the zoning is developed and a model that shows geographically the area that you're proposing will meet all of the state's requirements. So I'm going to go through all that, sort of boring but important stuff. And then Lee is going to talk to you about some of the site studies we've done to try to figure out where there might be some potential areas that would work in this community. And as he said, we're then going to turn this around and say, what are your thoughts about this and what suggestions do you have? Because you may know of some areas that we should be looking at that we haven't yet. So that is the plan. So I'll go through the overview first. So it is a statute. It was adopted by the legislature actually toward the end of 2021. It amends the Zoning Act. So I'm going to try not to default too much to acronyms in this, but it's hard when you do this work day in and day out. Chapter 40A of the Massachusetts General Laws is the Zoning Act. And this is creating Section 3A of the Zoning Act, and what it specifically says is that towns that are defined as MBTA communities have to zone for some multifamily development on what's called an as-of-right basis, which I will explain more. You have to have at least one district. Many communities are looking at multiple areas, so you're not trying to concentrate everything in one place. The issue is just that the sum of the land, if you're looking at more than one area, has to meet certain state requirements. The state has been, I think, kind of increasingly persistent, if you will, with communities to try to comply with this law. So the statute itself says if you don't comply, there are certain grant programs you are simply not eligible to receive. The state's guidelines, which are implementing the law, list a whole bunch of other grant programs for which you might be non-competitive. And there may be some other penalties as well, and I won't dwell too much on that right now. If you have questions about it, I'll try to answer them later. The three programs that are listed in the statute as a community not being eligible for if you don't comply with Section 3A is MassWorks, which I know your town has used before. Housing Choice, which is a discretionary grant program that's available to communities that are kind of producing housing, which God knows Plymouth is. So that's a tool for like a variety of different things, which I know you've received some funding for. And then there's this program called the Local Capital Projects Fund, which most people have never heard of, but it is actually a source of funding that your housing authority relies upon for maintenance of public housing. So those are three programs that the statute says, if you don't comply, you cannot get this money. Last week, the state released updated guidelines. We have seen, I think, four rounds of updated guidelines since this started. And the state has listed a whole bunch of other programs, which I won't read off all here. I'm assuming you can see this list. But these are programs that a town like yours would apply to, and in fact has applied to and has received money from, where the agencies that award the funds would look at whether you comply with the law and say, well, they do, therefore they get extra points, or they don't, therefore they're not competitive. So there's different tiers of, I guess, what you would call penalty here. So most of these are discretionary grants from a variety of agencies. The funds that typically are used to purchase conservation land, the funds that are obtained from an agency called Mass Development to help identify and move along some economic development projects, things of that nature would be, quote, non-competitive. So what makes something an MBTA community? It basically is, do you have or are you close to MBTA service, either rapid transit or a commuter rail station? So it's comprised of 175 communities or thereabouts. There are 14 which were the original hosts of MBTA service, and those you might as well think of as rapid transit. There are 51 more that over time were brought into the MBTA system as the system grew. There are communities that are adjacent to those towns that have a commuter rail station, which is actually where you folks fit right now. And then others that, for whatever reason, may have adopted a ballot question to be added to MBTA service. So when you put all those communities together, it's a little over 170. For purposes of this law, they are divided into different kinds of types, and there are different requirements that apply to each. So that map, which may be a little bit difficult to read, is that the darker the color, the tighter the compliance deadline, and the greater the expectations for compliance. And by that I mean, when you get close to Boston, you typically have a larger housing base anyway. So the expectation of the amount of housing you have to zone for is generally greater than it is out here. That's somewhat of an oversimplification, but it's a pretty honest one. And everyone is required to comply, so there's like no waiver built into the statute for anybody. So the basic requirements of the law are that you have to have zoning in one or more districts in which multifamily development is allowed on what's called an as-of-right basis at 15 units an acre. You cannot impose any kind of age restrictions in the zoning, and you can't impose any requirements on the size of units. So you can't limit units to 1 or 2 bedrooms. You can't require it to be age restricted. Of course, a developer could propose to do an age restricted development in an MBTA communities district, but the town can't require it. The district has to be either within a half mile of a commuter rail station or when that's possible, or in some kind of other sensible location. In other words, activity centers, downtowns, neighborhood areas, neighborhood activity centers, things of that nature. The district, according to the statute, must be of reasonable size, which of course the statute does not define. So that all fell to a state agency to try to sort all this out through the guidelines, which I'm going to talk about more as I go on. Those are sort of the issues in the statute. And there's these ineligibility for like those 3 grant programs I listed earlier. There's also a potential for communities to face some kind of civil rights action, which currently is going on right now with a town in central Massachusetts that has decided they're not going to comply. There are things the law does not do. So it doesn't require new housing development. It requires zoning, and they're very different indeed. It doesn't require you to pay for infrastructure to support new development. So if you decided to put an MBTA communities district over an area that already has multifamily housing, you can do that. If you want to put it somewhere else, you can do that. If the ability to use those zoning rights to create housing would require water or sewer or some other infrastructure, the town is not responsible for that. It is strictly about zoning. The law does not require the State Wetlands Act, doesn't override the State Wetlands Act, it doesn't override the State Environmental Code. And it doesn't provide any options for waivers or exemptions, as I said. So why do we have this? Every town I work in says, why is the state doing this to us? The state's doing it because the legislature adopted the law. So I think you have to start there. It is a law. It's not something that a state agency dreamed up in the middle of some night. It is a statute. It was a statutory change to the Zoning Act. That's why we're dealing with this. The Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, which we all knew as DHCD until a few weeks ago, their job under the statute is to create guidelines to fill in the blanks that are left by the legislation. So the legislation's very broad. There's a lot of room for interpretation, and it was left to the agency we're now calling HLC to sort all this out. So they have, in fact, developed guidelines, which I'm going to get to. They have created a system for communities to sort of work toward compliance. December 2024 is the deadline for most communities to have zoning in place that meets the requirements. That includes Plymouth, by the way. Their job also is to provide technical assistance to communities to figure out how to comply, which is what my firm and some others are doing with a number of towns. And then to just basically coordinate the work of all the people who are involved in this. There's not just HLC that's involved. There are other organizations that are providing help. There's just a lot of people involved, and somebody had to kind of drive the bus. So HLC is the agency that is doing that. So I'm going to talk about these guidelines now that I've referred to. So first of all, as I said, there are these tiers of deadline. The rapid transit communities, places like Chelsea, Brookline, they have a deadline of the end of this year to comply, and they're all working away on zoning to get there so that they have things in place by December 31st. And we happen to be working with Chelsea, so I know that system pretty well. The commuter rail communities and the, quote, adjacent communities, you folks, Kingston, that group, it's next year, the end of next year. Can you just hold your questions till I'm done? End of 2024 is the compliance deadline for those communities. We then have some very small towns that are kind of in the hinterlands of the Boston area that are adjacent to adjacent. They're very small. They have no infrastructure. Their deadline is actually the end of 2025. And there's not that many of those communities. There's like 30 of them. I don't know how well you know some of these outlying areas, but a town like Carlisle comes to mind north of Boston. It's a very small town. It has no infrastructure. It's a small adjacent community. So there are different deadlines here, and the assumption, I think, of HLC's part is the closer you are to rail, the greater the burden to comply. So that's why you have a deadline that is earlier than some very small towns, but your deadline is not the same as a Chelsea, a Brookline, a Lynn, those communities, Winchester. To have a district that complies, and bear in mind when I say a district, it could be in more than one location, but it's the same rules overall. The district has to be zoned for 15 units an acre of multifamily housing based on an analysis of the land that's developable. There's a minimum unit capacity that the zoning has to reach, and I'll talk about Plymouth in a bit. So not only do you have to zone for 15 units an acre, but the zoning itself, whether it's one district or 5, the sum of the units that could be developed under that zoning has to hit a certain target number. The district has to be either 50 acres or a minimum or 1.5% of your developable land. The minimum unit capacity, I said, varies by town. Might as well just say it now. It's 2807 for Plymouth. At least half the district must be in contiguous parcels, so you can't create a district that's so fragmented that nothing can happen. And in most areas, in most ways, at least any contiguous area has to be at least 5 acres. So there has to be a development site that's meaningful, and the district itself has to be contiguous enough that someone could actually do something at a reasonable scale. If you have a train station in your community, there is also a requirement, which fortunately you don't have to deal with this right now, but if you have a train station in your community, there has to be an analysis of how much land within the station area, which is generally a half mile of the station, how much of that is developable. And based on how much of that there is, some percentage of your district has to be in that location. So if I were giving this talk in Kingston tonight, I would be filling in these numbers more. But just so you know, there's this assumption that if you have rail, or you're very close to it, again, you have to provide more of the housing near the transit facility. That really is sort of the point of the law. Whoops. This concept of zoned capacity is something that I think trips a lot of people up. So zoned capacity, it's a hypothetical yield based on the regulations of your district. So if you zone for 15 units an acre, you have to have enough land at 15 units an acre to reach a number. In Plymouth, it's 2,807 units. And they have to be permitted as of right across the district. It's not limited to vacant land. There is no requirement to construct units in any of these districts. It's not concerned with existing units. So if you wanted to put, as I said, your 3A district on top of a place that's already got multifamily housing, you can do that. And you don't it doesn't matter whether a developer could satisfy Title V, doesn't matter whether a developer has access to sewer, none of that matters. What matters is, what does the zoning say? That's what matters. So again, there's this formula that's used to determine how many units you have to zone for, that concept of zoned capacity. And because you're an adjacent community, it's 10% of your housing according to Census 2020. So 2807 is 10% of the housing count that the Census Bureau reported from Census 2020. So the fact that it says as of right doesn't mean a developer can just walk into the building department with a set of plans and say, I want my building permit. Your town can require, and most of them are, some type of a site plan review process. So that ostensibly the planning board, it doesn't have to be the planning board, but it usually is, can review a proposed development for adequacy of access, pedestrian circulation, the design of the buildings, and so forth. There has to be some way for someone to be able to look at the plans for the project and say, this will work, it's okay, impacts on surrounding properties are minimized, and access is safe. You can't use site plan review to deny a project. You can use it to condition a project. So planning, and that's true now. So site plan review it's a way to review uses that don't require a special permit. It's a way to make sure that someone's looking at a plan before someone gets a building permit. That's already true. So just making the point that that is also the case with MBTA communities districts. There is a recent change in the guidelines, which won't benefit Plymouth, but it might benefit a few communities that have existing mixed-use zoning. The concept of commercial on the first floor and upper-story housing, where if a community has has mixed-use zoning that basically allows multifamily housing as liberally as it would have to in an MBTA communities district, that you may qualify for a reduction in your zoned capacity number. In other words, a reduction of that 2,807 units. But to the best of my knowledge, you do not meet the requirements for that exemption, so I'm not even going to talk about it tonight. If you disagree, I'll leave that to you. You can require up to 10% of the units to be affordable, or up to 20% if you can prove that the higher percentage won't make development uneconomic. So the burden is on the community if it's going to require more than 10% affordable units to prove that that does not interfere with the feasibility of development. You can define affordable however you want. It's not limited to the definitions that apply under Chapter 40B. We have communities in the greater Boston area that are looking in their MBTA communities districts to hit a little above 80% of median income is the standard for Chapter 40B. There are communities that are looking to go a little above that because they can't really serve those households in a typical Chapter 40B development very easily, but with this zoning they could. And then you have an existing Chapter 40R district in your town over at Cottage Park. I believe it's 25% affordable requirement, as I recall. So a community that wants to use that tool to comply with this new MBTA communities law can do so, but they can't require the high percentage of affordable units that you have now. So with advice from the planning department, we looked at 7 locations through the compliance model that I'm doing it too, that HLC requires. And I'll just give you a little snapshot of this, and I'm going to turn this over to Lee. So it is a model that's based in Excel. It's a big workbook. We work with data from MassGIS, which is the state's Geographic Information System library. It is a massive program that was designed by a couple of consultants for HLC. And basically what happens when a community says, we want to look at this area, they give us the assessor's parcel numbers, we plug it into the model, and the model's going to tell us how much land in that area is not developable and therefore has to be discounted from the calculation because it's knitting together parcel data with other information. So we try to get to how many acres do you actually need if you want to stay with 15 units an acre and still get to your 2,800 units. So we looked at 7 different locations, trying to get the model to sort of estimate what the yield would be based on some assumptions about minimum lot area per unit, what the required parking would be, what requirements for open space there might be, and how many units per lot, as I said. So where you're an adjacent community, this is just a snapshot. I've pretty much already told you this. Your minimum district size is 50 acres. Your minimum district size is 50 acres. Your minimum density does need to be 15 units, and fortunately, you don't have to have any of them in a station area because we just fall outside that radius. So with that, Lee's department was able to identify a number of locations, several of which already have some multifamily development in them. And I'm going to turn this over to you.
So this isn't anything magical, just basically having worked in this town for over 35 years, I kind of came through and said, I know several sites that I think might be appropriate. It's not necessarily the whole list. The way we've done this, what I wanted to do is be able to come to the community and say, we have options of how we can comply with this mandate from the state. And again, we'll go with these 7 sites. If you have other suggestions, we would be happy to look at those. I wanted to, and the model is very complex. Thank you very much for doing it for me because it's a very complex model. So before we started to have any discussions with the community, I wanted to make sure that, yes, we have options, and I want to just run through those. So the first one is Cottage Park. So Cottage Park is our existing 40R district that we already talked about. It's got already about 300 multifamily units there. As Cottage Park through the 40R, it's approved for 675 units already. So there is an option here where either superimposing a multifamily as of right district over the existing development, and depending on how you did it, it could end up at the 675 that's already permitted without any additional new development above and beyond what the town has already allowed. Or this could be a site that could allow for some additional density. I know that the property owners are looking at trying to figure out ways for additional density. So there is an option here to either superimpose over the existing 40R district at the 675, or to allow for some additional density. And again, this is on Route 3A, down on the water. You've got 3V there, you've got the new multifamily apartments, and I'm very excited about the new Vitamin C brewery that's gonna pop up in that building. Oh, no, that's Untold. Sorry, Untold. The second site that we were asked to look at was the TL Edgewood site. Now, so this is that beautiful site when you're coming out from western part of Route 44, and you're going to merge onto Route 3, and on the left you have all those wonderful derricks and the huge piles of sand right on the Kingston town line. So this was another site we looked at with, it's 42 acres in size, and again, you can see the range of units that you could possibly get there with the rezoning. The thing I would point out about this, and the one we have to be careful about, Judi did mention that as a town, we're not required to provide infrastructure to a development, but in a case like this where you have town water that goes right in front of this built property, and we know we have an issue with water in this area, I think to look at this site, we would really have to talk to town council and be, I'm a little concerned about zoning by right for something of this kind of density, and then turning around to a developer or a property owner and saying, well, yeah, we did this, but we don't have the water, so you can't do it. But again, it's a site that I think everybody's looked at and thought that maybe there's a better use than what we see there today. Again, we look at Colony Place. So at Colony Place, we'll talk about, we have the Walk 40B, 320 units, Sawyer's Reach, multifamily, age-restricted behind it, and Claremont property, which is a recently approved rental, 55 and older. So if you looked at that neighborhood, and again, superimposing this over those already permitted projects, wouldn't really, I don't want to say wouldn't allow for any additional growth, but additional growth would be unlikely because they're already developed residentially. But again, there's the range of yield that you'd be getting by looking at some or all of those properties, 800 to 1,200 units. Commerce Way, this will have the same issue with water. So this is the land behind or in front of the Market Basket, or I guess I have to say Market Basket. So there is a large piece. Originally, it was slated for the Target, which chose not to leave Kingston. But there is a large undeveloped piece of property there that could have and would have the potential for 200 to 400 units. Again, my concern there would be the impact on the water. And I'm not saying that any of these sites make sense or don't make sense. We're really here to hear from you, to hear how you feel about it. The Oasis, which interestingly, so this is the project that is behind Home Depot. Its actually density of development is about 15 units per acre already. So when we talk about this project or this development and what 15 units per acre means, when you look at either the Walk, which is under construction behind Dick's Sporting Goods, or the Oasis behind Home Depot, that's the density we're talking about. So at 2,800 units, we're talking about 9 of these projects, or 32 of those individual buildings. And again, it's hypothetical. They're not saying you have to build it, but those are the kinds of numbers we're talking about. So in this case, you have the Oasis project itself, which is under construction. You could superimpose it about this. I don't think we could do just a single lot, though. And so there are a couple of adjacent lots that they own that if you included those vacant lots, again, would allow for some additional development, not a lot more, but 300 to 700 additional units there. Pine Hills, we know we have a lot of multifamily in the Pine Hills. And when we've looked at what's in there already, and again, just superimposing not on the whole Pine Hills, not on the whole village of the Pine Hills, but only upon the Avalon, the Mark, and Hanover, and the new Brizzuto property, you could superimpose it. And again, when you talk about our requirement for 2,800 units on the high range here, just in the Pine Hills alone, that would be 1,700 units. And Red Brook, again, another community that has a lot of multifamily. Superimposing over that existing multifamily can give us a range, too, for compliance. And this is a summary. And again, so the decision the town has is, do we meet the technical requirements of this town, of this requirement, state state law, Or do we want to create some additional housing in the community? And that's a question we want to ask you and hear from you. So we gave a whole range. There could be other sites we could look at too, but this does show you that at a 2,700 unit, the options I have outlined already get us well within that range and gives us plenty of flexibility to look at what makes the most sense for the community. So with that, I think we're just looking for what you have to say or what your thoughts are, or any questions you might have. And we do have a microphone here, because this is being taped for people out there to watch.
Rich Cirque, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 2. You're characterizing Plymouth as an adjacent community. It has a rail station, but it's not functioning.
Right.
So, but you're confident that since it's not functioning, although it's there, it's an adjacent community?
You are currently classified as an adjacent community. Every time we provide any sort of report for a community, we are always saying, based on the guidelines in effect as of X date. Right now, you are an adjacent community. We are not getting any read that that's going to change. But I'm not going to stand here and tell you that it's not going to change. I just know right now what we have to deal with is the facts we have.
What would happen if the train became functional?
And we will have to figure that out. My first step would be to plead with the Commonwealth to say, we've met your requirements, we should be grandfathered. But there's very good chance that if that does open up, they could be coming to us with a scenario with higher density at Cordage or in North Plymouth with a number of 4,200 units, not the 2,800.
Kevin Leary, Precinct 1. So with what you've identified, that's not as scary as conversations you and I have had before about dumping it all in North Plymouth. I wonder what kind of blowback are you going to get from putting it, using existing, like Pine Hills or something like that?
So I think if you try to figure out what the Commonwealth is doing, good luck. But I think what they're saying is you can take credit for a high-density development you already have in the community. And if you've already done high-density development and you want to take credit for that, you can. If you want to do additional, you can do that too. But I think this has worked in a way where they don't mind if you take credit for something that's already there that's high density.
The law does not require production. The law requires zoning.
Yeah.
So this came up early on from a community we're working with that was considering putting an existing age-restricted development in a 3A district, what we call a 3A district. And originally, HLC was saying, oh, that might be a problem. And then they said, no, actually, because as long as someone could come along and propose a multifamily development that's not age-restricted at 15 units an acre, if the zoning will allow that, that meets the statute. That is the wisdom we have at this time.
So when you talk about a community that's gotten a lot of grants, Plymouth is there. So in no way would we want to discourage anything going forward. So I think the optimum thing to do is maybe not go just for the number, approve a little bit more, so maybe 3 parcels. And we have the time to do it. I think a little more education, but I think we have the time to do it. And they're there, so in the future, if something's going to have to be torn down, they're just held to that requirement for density and all of that. But as long as the units are already there, it's not a change. And Plymouth has gone through enough change that we'd be better off using the capabilities we already have, because we've got plenty of increased traffic, but by the looks of this, we don't have to increase it more because we can use what we have.
Yeah, and our original conversations were when the train station was open.
Right.
And so that's changed, and
Yeah.
that's been the big change that's given us a lot of flexibility.
Yeah. So that's worked out to our benefit.
Steve Lyden, I have a question. You mentioned like the overlay districts, Pine Hills, Red Brook, do they have to be involved in that decision? That's town meeting? If we.
Go ahead, Lee, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's a vote of town meeting, but when we sent this out, and we're going to do another one September 11th down at Plymouth South High School, we've sent a blast out to the residents of both Red Brook and Pine Hills to say that this is something we're looking at. So, the objective is to try to keep them as informed as possible. But what I would say in both Red Brook and Pine Hills case is if we choose to go that route, there should be, minimal, if any, impact on those communities, because that development is already there.
Okay. If we get the zoning in for the 22,000-something acres, do we have a requirement on when these properties have to be built?
No.
Is there a timeline? There's
No.
no timeline. So they never could be built?
Correct.
It's about having the zoning.
Okay, so it's just the zoning. All right, thank you.
My name is Dr. Cowett. I live at the Pine Hills. I'm a data person, having been in academics my whole life. On your Pine Hills statement, you said the maximum height is 3 stories, but the Avalon is like 6, and the Avalon is 6, and the new monstrosity, the new apartment building on the green is 4. So that's wrong. That's number one. Number two,
Well, if I could answer that just
Of
first.
course.
So it has nothing to do with what's there already. So this is a hypothetical zoning that you just put over that. So the likelihood that they're going to come in and knock down their 6-story building so they could build a 3-story building.
Is 0.
Yeah. So, again, what you're looking at is what's there. What we're looking at is saying to the community, if you want to minimize the impacts of this, here's a way to do it with minimal risk to the community.
and when we were looking at the Pine Hills to move there 8 years ago, one of the quote advantages was that 2/3 of the land mass would be left open. How would this affect?
That would stay the same. That commitment is there, it's binding, this would not change anything. And again, this would only be superimposed over existing multifamily development. It wouldn't be imposed over the golf course, it wouldn't be imposed over
Oh, you
a
can take the
single or
golf
two,
course. I don't care about that.
or a single or two-family, neighborhoods with single or two-family units. It would only be over the existing apartment complexes there.
I'm sorry, I'm only a pediatrician. I don't understand that.
So if we did a overlay zone, we can pick and identify where that is. It's not like it's the whole Pine Hills. We would take a zone, and I could probably show it to you, but it would just
Take a piece of it.
conveniently fit over the Mark, Avalon, and Pizzuto if you wanted to, and just say, here's our zone, and it happens to just sit over the existing apartments.
So it would be no new apartments.
Right, well, again, I don't want to say that definitely, but pretty close, unless somebody wanted to rip those down or figure out a way to do some additional development, it would be pretty minimal.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for doing it, doing all this and for coming here. Art Disclosures, Precinct 15. Just on your chart that you had, Lee, if we were to be an MBTA community, using the numbers you showed, does that mean we'd be in compliance with the?
No, so if the train station opens, and if they don't grandfather us, and if the state says, but now that it's open, all the work you just did doesn't apply, and you have to do it over, our number is 4,200 units, with a big chunk of that having to be within half a mile of the train station.
Yeah.
So it would be a radical change. My fear has always been, and when we first looked at this, when we were a transit community, that could totally transform North Plymouth. When you're talking about an area with predominantly single and two-family homes that you rezone to allow for 15 units per acre, you could easily see how somebody could start to buy up neighborhoods, knock down the existing cottage homes, and really transform the community. I do believe to some extent that's what some of the goal is of the Commonwealth. So if the train station opens and if we're subject to that, it's a whole new discussion for the whole community. Again, my first step will be to go to our state reps and say, please find a way to grandfather us.
Hello, David Peck, member of the Planning Board. Just trying to understand numbers. If you overlay it over existing multifamily areas, how many of those 2,807 units are already there? So what is the delta of developable
It
land?
really doesn't matter, because all they want to do is say, all right, you have 20 acres of land at 15 units per acre, 20 developable. So they'll look at things like wetlands, roads, those come out of it, and then they'll say, okay, you have 20 acres of land here. We're not even looking at what's there now. And based on those 20 acres, at 15 units per acre, that's 300 units. That's simple.
But they don't,
You don't take credit for what's there.
Because they don't, it's not about production.
See, you're trying to make sense
Yeah.
with Commonwealth law.
Yeah.
It doesn't
yeah,
make
well,
sense.
and of course, the other, what's the definition of developable? I mean, are they looking for empty land that could be on?
No, no. The deductions in the model are things like wetlands, based on maps from the Department of Environmental Protection, roads. It doesn't matter what's on the land now.
So the 2807 is kind of theoretical,
It's
calculated.
10%.
It has nothing to do with 1,000 units might already
is
be sitting on that land, or
10%
1,500.
Of your Census 2020 housing count. That's what it means.
So it comes back, it's just zoning, it's not
Yes, sir.
necessarily building, a net
correct.
1,000 or 1,500 new
Right.
units.
But that's the question for the community. One of the things that we hope to hear a little more about here is, what does the community want? Do we need to, and we heard from Kevin already, that we should meet the technical requirement, maybe with a little more, or I've heard from other people in the community that we should do more and provide more housing. And again, stress that this isn't affordable housing. This is just the minimum 10% affordable that we already have in our bylaw. Actually, probably a little less than that, because you can't round up. The law won't allow that. So it's more about, do we want to create more affordable housing, not affordable, more multifamily housing? Or do we want to try to meet the minimum requirement, or is there some area in between? And again, that's what we're really looking for, to give you guidance when we come back and say, okay, we need to do an article for the next town meeting. What direction do we take?
Steve Lyden again. So I would rather go with the technical, because there is no such thing as affordable housing. You can call it whatever you want. It's not affordable housing. $1,800, $2,000 a month for an apartment is not affordable. We need workforce apartments or housing. We don't need this affordable stuff anymore, because it's not true. And so I would like to go with the technical, no more building, because we really don't need it. Our schools are crowded. We don't have the water. The traffic is terrible. So the only way to go is, I think, technical. Thank you.
And just for Steve's comment, one of the interesting things about the state 40B law, which is the affordable housing law, they put Plymouth into the Boston-Cambridge standard statistical metropolitan area. And so they're comparing incomes and house values to what it is in the Boston-Cambridge area. So when we talk about affordable, we're talking about incomes of 85, 90,000 for a family is what they consider affordable. So again, it's kind of difficult, because we're using, the state is making us use the Boston area as our standard.
I don't want to be accused of defending state government, but I want to correct one thing. It's actually the federal government that places Plymouth within the Boston metro area.
Well, the state uses that standard.
Well, of course they do, because it affects federal money that's spent on housing in Massachusetts, but we won't go there tonight.
Thanks. Peter Foreman, Plymouth resident, South Shore Chamber of Commerce. Two comments. One, we have been promoting more multifamily throughout the South Shore. Plymouth has done a nice job with housing production. I think that's one reason Plymouth is just booming with activity and economic growth. So even though you've done a nice job, we think there needs to be more multifamily throughout the area. What you're looking at is interesting on how you might target some areas, but I'm interested in your thought as a planner about how you use housing to leverage more community development, placemaking, economic growth out of that, rather than just zoning for it. And to the extent you've done that, what are the neighboring towns doing, particularly Kingston, and is that going to, do you think that would factor into your thinking as well? Because they're going to have to do a lot. They're right on the border, and it's worth thinking what that means to a neighboring town and how you work together for the infrastructure planning that might come, or economic development.
So I'm pretty cynical about density alone in a regional market, that somehow that's going to create affordability. So the goal here is
what he
just,
said.
well, no, I'm just saying, so providing additional housing in Plymouth, I'm not sure that necessarily is going to accomplish a lot. I think, though, when you look at downtown Plymouth, and we have a general store now that just opened, we're not just, slowly now, not just bars and restaurants, and I think you need that kind of residential density around your commercial areas to support things more than just a restaurant and a bar, to be a destination for tourists or people from outside the region. So yes, I definitely think that the more residential we have, especially this day and age within walking distance, does start to change the profile of the community. I can't wait to see a CVS or maybe a little grocery store show up too, and that will show us that we really have some density. But I'll let you talk about what other communities are doing.
So you had asked about Kingston, and I can't address that. I'm not sure where they are with it. I can tell you, a little closer to the Boston area, we are working with a couple of contiguous communities that are having an interesting conversation about where there might be some intersection in the areas that they would like to zone. My worry about it is that it feels a little bit like throwing the multifamily housing at the town line. So you have to sort of think about, is there a way to make a place here? Or is it move it as far away from people as you can? And we're working toward the place part of it, but that means the community would actually want the housing. And I think that's really, Peter, where a lot of the challenge is with this law, is that it is true that production is not required. So what we see more often than not is people having conversations just like this, where they're looking for ways to be able to lay the zoning on an area where the housing already exists, rather than creating opportunities to build more housing. So the effectiveness of this law as an agent of housing development, I think, is, the jury's very much out on it. You know, you can certainly, through your site plan guidelines, do a lot to encourage development that has amenity space that actually makes a place desirable to people. And when you start getting those kind of investments made through the private development, it increases your competitiveness for things like MassWorks to perhaps do more on the public realm. But, you know, it has to start with, do we actually want to encourage more housing development here? We have a few communities that are having that conversation seriously, that do. Most of them are not so sure. So I think any of us who would like to see housing developed, the jury's out on this law.
Rich Cirque again. I'm trying to identify in my mind the constituencies that would not want to do what we're talking about, namely zone the land in which the multifamily structures already exist. I mean, I don't think there's, I may be wrong, but I don't think there's much of an appetite in Plymouth to do anything but that. What am I missing? Where are the interests that would want to create more multifamily housing in Plymouth, given what we have?
I have heard it. Not here tonight, but I have heard it. Again, I don't want to, the whole point here too is I don't want to just make that assumption. I want to hear from the community, so when we come back, we're doing something where we're not just simply saying, I think I know better. I've been here, I've seen what's happened. We really want to kind of just start off at a place to say, let's hear from the community before we just start to make the assumptions. I think your assumption is more correct than someone who maybe wants to see a lot of additional residential development. You can talk to the fire chief and police chief. They're really struggling to try to keep up with the growth that has occurred. So yeah, I think I hear that more than I hear people saying, yes, we have to do more to create more housing in the community.
And would the quantum of vote at town meeting still be 2/3 or majority?
Majority.
Majority, okay.
Majority, yeah, just one vote.
Kevin Larry again. So another point that when Peter was talking about more housing or, however it's fashioned, there's a lot more implications that we're struggling with right now. Fire departments. We're going through that planning process. Are we going to need more? Almost every fire station we have except North Plymouth, because it's new, needs to be remodeled or enlarged. Police. We've been fighting that struggle for years. How do you get more people? And plus, I can't verify this, but I hear that this would be the fire department. I've heard that a lot of the calls that they're making are to multifamily housing because you just have more people, you have more issues. The closer you get people together, you have more issues. So through the grapevine, I've heard that they do make a lot of calls to these larger units. Now, that's just through the grapevine. I don't know if it's true. But, so that's just what I'm getting at is North Plymouth is talking about tearing down 2 schools and building 1. So any additional building that you proposed, in my mind, it's bad enough to leave it to the developers, but if we single out parcels, we better be prepared to add to the school district, be concerned about ambulance service, fire service, all of that kind of thing. Now, we have a couple of parcels that are already developed. We have more than we need to choose from. I don't see anything wrong with making Cottage one of the units because it's next to the train station. God forbid they activated the train station. We already have a large chunk of it right there. And we're not using any more services than we are currently. The other thing is with the water. Didn't we just approve some money at last town meeting for the new well or new pump to boost the water in North Plymouth?
So the water issue we talked about is in West Plymouth, and it really is a temporary issue. It's based on, it's a 1 million gallon shortfall that is based on in the summer during a drought, if one of the 3 wells goes down and there's a fire.
Yeah.
You say, well, that would never happen. Well, as soon as you do it, it will happen.
Right.
So it's the redundancy that they're trying to take care of in that they have a temporary fix that we're working on right now with that Claremont 55 and older development
Yep.
where they're designing and hopefully will build a booster pump that will connect North Plymouth to West Plymouth to do a temporary solve. But then they will be coming back to town meeting long run for an additional well in West Plymouth.
Yeah. So just my opinion, I'd be in favor of including more parcels than is necessary. I mean, the state always likes things like that happen. And if we have the ability to do it without having a bunch of irate people in town, again, Plymouth has done very well with grants, and the best thing we can do is keep that going in the future.
So I've heard the same comments from both police and fire chief about the services. I haven't seen any statistical data, but they have both relayed that concern.
Eric Dykeman, Precinct 1. Just a quick question about, we've mentioned Cottage a few times. Does Cottage mean just the Cottage, or is that a larger overlay that would incorporate Hedge Road, Prince Street, that sort of a thing?
No, it's just Cottage.
Just Cottage.
At this point, this is where we're starting. So if somebody comes and says, we think you should overlay this on Hedge Road and add Hedge Road to that, or some other area, we can always consider that. At this point, no, we have not done that modeling. David, Evelyn's coming up.
Okay.
Evelyn Strawn, Precinct 2, and I think that I have a reputation in town for being very concerned about open space and conservation issues, so I can't believe that I'm even making a comment about this in terms of the water, but I think this is a much more complicated question, and to say that, well, we need another well, there are other options. I mean, there are things that Plymouth could be doing now and should be looking at that would not necessitate more wells. I mean, for instance, our neighboring town of Kingston does not allow irrigation systems to be put in. So there are things that can be done that would maximize our existing. So I think that we need to focus on some creative solutions as well as just saying no because of the usual arguments. Thank you.
David Peck again. Question, why didn't you include the Obery Street apartments in the 7 you were looking at? I don't know whether, whether the parcel's too small?
Which one is the Obery Street? You mean the ones right next to the assisted living?
Yes.
Again, we came up with numbers that are well in excess of what we need for compliance, so we could certainly consider that, but I think if the message comes from the community to do the minimum, or maybe I'm hearing maybe a minimum plus a little, there's no need to even look at that and go into
Okay,
that
but it
area.
would be a candidate in a way,
Yeah.
because it's located near an intersection, and it's
I'd
already
be very
dense.
concerned about zoning a single parcel, so.
Oh, yeah.
One of the other restrictions is you couldn't take the county farm property, because A, it's owned by the county, and B, there's a conservation restriction on it. So I think if we did this, you would have to do it over the apartment and probably the nursing home next door.
Yep.
No guarantee that nursing home, I'm pretty confident to say the apartments aren't gonna go anyplace in the next 80
Yeah.
years, but the nursing home could change, and that could be a demolition and a construction. I don't know if I'd really want to zone a single, I don't know what the state would say to a single lot overlay district.
Okay, again, just following up on the theory of overlaying existing
Yeah, sure.
multifamily, that's a recent one, and it's well located.
Yep.
So,
Thank you.
Kathy Dunn, Chair of Affordable Housing and
Please do not keep your hand on the microphone. We need to hear like every movement of your hand.
Okay. I'll introduce myself again then. Kathy Dunn, Chair of Affordable Housing Trust and Precinct 4. I just want an assurance that if there is an overlay on Cottage Park or Oasis, that the existing affordable housing will still exist and not be impacted.
If the affordability that exists at Cottage is under current zoning, another overlay under Section 3A isn't going to remove that. That applies to that development.
In
What?
perpetuity, regular type.
Yeah.
Sorry.
If it's a Chapter 40B development, a comprehensive permit, that has a deed restriction that is recorded with the Registry of Deeds, and I actually believe that the Cordage does as well.
Yeah,
That doesn't go away.
okay.
Allowing zoning at 15 units an acre with 10% affordable doesn't change the fact that there are existing deed restrictions controlling the affordability of what exists now.
So almost all of the new affordable development we've done, whether it's through the planning board and zoning board or 40Bs, have been in perpetuity.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question that if we had a 40B that say some can have, is it as low as 50?
30
years, that in 30 years after that restriction expires, that they could then retroactively do something at a lower rate. But we don't have those, and all the sites we have here are deed restricted in perpetuity.
Okay.
And those restrictions will continue to hold in force as long as they're being monitored.
Yeah. Very
Don't
good.
forget that.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Loring Tripp, resident of Plymouth. I have a few concerns about this in that, one, as I think would help the presentation, is there was a discussion about what 40B is and how it mandates housing in communities and sets a limit, where this really isn't a mandate at all, but it's a zoning overlay. And it creates a value to land that doesn't currently exist, but creates the density of a 40B without mandating it. So it kind of leaves it to market forces. So my concern about this is really it's zoning without a plan, and it's mandated by the state. And that's concerning, because really now you're trying to create what really is a zoning shell game, in which you create these little cups over different areas of your town, and underneath it is this zoning overlay. But is there housing under it? And you lift it up? No, there's no housing under it. So really, I think what we need to really think about in strategic spatial planning is where are the areas in the next 20, 40, 60 years that we can put population density and be assured that we can provide the services such as water, infrastructure, education, public safety. And how we put these cups over our property should really be part of a bigger plan and not just a arbitrary requirement from the state. On saying that and understanding that this is linked to funding and grants, I think that there is a way that we can do this without having a negative impact. But when you create this artificial increase in value based on a arbitrary goal and objective of creating housing in the state, it's really completely disemboweled and disconnected from a plan and a vision of what a community or even what the state wants to be. So as we're putting the shell game out there, knowing that there might be a P under there or there might not be, and we shuffle these around on the deck, I think we really need to step back and say, let's not deal with this as just a separate issue, but how does this fit into our affordable housing and infrastructure plans for the next 20, 40, 60 years? That's the time that we need between now and December 12, 24, to really have that as part of this discussion. So those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Are you a planner? Because you sound like one.
It is very interesting whether you look at 40B or this regulation, how the state so tries to be uniform. My example is always when you try to look at Quincy, Boston, Cambridge, Dalton, Mass, Sheffield, and Plymouth, there's just no way you can design something that works for all communities. So I think they're trying the best they can, whether it's 40B or this, to create a law, apply it uniformly, but then in practice, you can just see how, it would almost be better if they did this town by town with something that made a little sense for each community, but that's probably impossible. Anyone else?
Do you get to amend the plan in 10 years? What plan? This plan, when you have a plan, to Loring's point, if you decide.
Oh, definitely.
Start it with existing and then-
So what we're looking at now is make sure we meet the minimum requirements. There's nothing that would prevent the town from going above and beyond that. Again, I think my sense is that last time I looked, over the last 5 years, Plymouth is the third fastest growing community in the Commonwealth, only behind Boston and Cambridge. So when I have this discussion with people, and if we were talking about a stable environment with a stable amount of growth, I think that's a different conversation than in the community that has had seen so much growth. When you look at Cottage Park, the Sawmill 40B, the Oasis 40B, and the Walk 40B, that's over 1,000 units right there in just those developments alone that are either just recently constructed or under construction. That, to me, as a planner, is a phenomenal amount of growth in one community. And so I think that's the challenge we have. And I think, yes, I think you'll see as a community, except for 40B, the growth rate in this town will slow down because there's not the amount of developable land that we've seen in the past. And maybe there's a different conversation once that starts to happen. Okay, well, I think we're done. Thank you very much for attending. And again, we're going to do it on September 11th. If you want to do it again, or if you want to encourage other people to go to that, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to see you.